Thanks very much. I'm Cliff Pryor. I'm CEO of the GSG, the Global Steering Group for Impact Investment. I'm delighted to introduce Daniel Hanna, Global Head of Sustainable Finance at Standard Chartered Bank, for this interview on enabling a just transition in emerging markets. Okay, so Daniel, let's start with the basics. What is a just transition?
Well, Cliff, first of all, can I say I'm really pleased to be here. A great audience, and it's been fantastic listening to some of the panels. And it's really exciting that we've got a just transition as a key topic, because I think this is going to be one of the big themes coming out over the next sort of 12 to 24 months. If GFANZ and the Glasgow COP was about mobilizing capital, the next set of COPs have got to tackle this issue of a just transition. So what is it? Well, fundamentally, a just transition is about putting people at the center of climate change policies. And it's really one where you maximize the benefits of tackling climate change while minimizing the economic and social impacts, and particularly for communities, workers, and consumers. And this is something that was set out in the Paris Agreement right at the beginning of a lot of this process. And it's really about making sure that as we shift to net zero, it is a process that is seen as fair and is fair across regions, across different communities, sectors, genders, and minorities. And sort of linking back into the UN's Sustainable Development Goals, it's really about making sure that no one is left behind. There's no doubt transition is a huge positive, I think, for the planet in terms of not clearly in terms of tackling climate change, but also in terms of tackling externalities like air pollution, creating new jobs. But this does come with some disruption. And as we've seen in, say, Europe with the phase out of coal over sort of decades, in some places this works better in others. So how do we make sure this transition happens in a way that doesn't leave long-term employment scarring, that doesn't sort of create issues for people's living standards, I think is absolutely critical. And once you put this on a macro scale, if you think about the link into climate justice, take a place like Africa. Africa generates probably around 4% of global emissions at the moment, has contributed almost negligibly to climate change, has 600 million people without access to any kind of power. How do we ensure a transition happens so that Africa's living standards continue to rise, but also that we tackle the very pressing need for climate change action at the same time?
That's a great description in the theory. Give us an example. An example of a just transition in practice?
Well, let me give you an example outside of sort of the classic one of renewables or anything else. But actually, we did a very large billion-dollar project in East Africa of creating a railway, which shifted goods that were being transported by sort of diesel, heavy sort of guzzling trucks, and put it onto a railway system. It's going through financing at the moment. Now, not only is that project in itself going to create hundreds of thousands of jobs in terms of the economic impact, create further growth, reduce the emissions generated by shifting goods, but also in creating that project, we're leaving a legacy of environmental and social awareness and guidance and methodologies in the local universities and in the local government so that they can assess future projects to ensure that when they are implementing transition projects, green projects, that actually the social impact is also considered. So that would be a good example of a just transition. Where it gets more complicated is clearly where you've got economies, and Africa again is a great example of this, which are highly dependent on hydrocarbons or coal, and actually the movement away into low carbon business models creates a significant disruption for local communities. And that's why you were seeing, for example, the energy transition mechanism that was announced at the last COP for South Africa about putting funding to work to help manage that transition over a period of time.
Of course, that particular example, there was, I think, an 8.5 billion 20-year project which had that just transition approach to it. But 20 years is probably potentially five different presidents. So to be provocative, is this transition just allowing us to go for coal longer than we should be doing?
No, I think it's not that, but I think what it does talk to is, one, it talks to the generational shift that is required and just the sheer amount of capital required. We put out a report last year called Zeronomics, which interviewed the top 250 companies across the world and said, okay, so where are you in terms of moving to net zero? And three things came out as the sort of impediments or issues of why they weren't moving to net zero. One was, frankly, a lack of urgency. So I think the majority of companies said they weren't going to plan to do anything until the 2030s, right? We don't have till the 2030s. Second, though, was a lack of finance, and the third was a lack of standards. And I think on the finance in particular, this is a critical issue for emerging markets, for the global south, and frankly, for all of us. So we've got a report coming out quite soon called Just in Time. And we've shown that effectively there is currently a $98 trillion financing gap to help emerging markets achieve net zero by 2060. So it's not even 2050, by 2060. Now, if that funding, that $98 trillion, comes purely from the emerging markets themselves, it is likely to leave those economies $79 trillion worse off. So you've got a collection of countries that have contributed the least, arguably, to climate change, face significant risks. In fact, many of the emerging markets have faced twice the amount of impact, negative impact from climate change already, but effectively are left with this very extraordinary bill that will cost them in terms of that transition. Now, if you flip that around, if the developed economies start funding that, then actually what you find is the wealth effect is positive. There's a 68 trillion wealth effect, the positive side, in emerging markets. And actually that growth lifts global GDP by 4 trillion. So if we can find effectively just transition mechanisms on a global scale that can really support these markets move to low carbon business models, leapfrog to these kind of technologies, actually we're all going to be better off as a result.
Fantastic. What would you see as the barriers to this kind of financing?
Well, I think to a certain extent, it is the financing itself. We do need to find a way to do that. And unfortunately, at the moment, the amount of global capital moving into these markets is pretty low. We did another survey, and we found that if you look at the top asset managers globally, that between them control about $50 trillion of assets under management. The amount that's gone into Africa, the Middle East, and Latin America is 2%, 3%, and 4% of their total AUM. So we just need to find a way to mobilize this capital at a much greater and a much, much bigger phase. One of the sort of issues that kind of will help support that is clearly emerging standards around things like sustainable finance and also just this definition of net zero. And we do need sort of better definitions around transition, a just transition as well. We need market by market sort of net zero playbooks. And we need to be recognizing that different countries will have their different emissions pathways. But clearly a little bit of this is also going to be about a shift in kind of risk appetite. There's a reason why this capital is not flowing. And so that's where the role of blended finance becomes really important. How do the private sector and public sector come together to risk share? So effectively the public sector takes the bit of the risk that is stopping the private sector from moving into that space and then catalyze much more to happen. And here, I think we've started to see some of these things emerging with a just transition sort of focus. The multilateral banks like the World Bank have just put out some high-level principles, which I think is really positive. And we've started to see a number of kind of blended transactions. We did another one for water, for example, in Angola, which gave 2 million people access to clean water for the first time in a blended finance structure. But that kind of situation needs to be rapidly replicated and scaled. And I think when it comes to this theme of a just transition more broadly, we really do need to move from the slogan, if you like, to the actual metrics and the way that this gets implemented.
And thinking about the just transition, so the G7 created this impact task force, which was published in December, and that identified 3 elements: environment, which you would expect, the social side, which you would also expect. The other one was community voices, and that sounds to me very important, but also very difficult to do, particularly if you're looking at large-scale financing. How do you see that?
Yeah, I think, so I'd answer that in 2 parts. The first, I think, with large-scale financing as a whole, I think the finance industry has increasingly focused on the social issues coming out, and there's no doubt that we have more work to do. So as you think about how things like the Equator Principles, which is the sort of best practice standards for large project financing, has evolved over the last few years, it is increasingly bringing these things in. And of course, I mean, other areas like biodiversity and other things also need to be brought in. So that sort of social consideration, the issues around resettlement, around indigenous communities, that is definitely a very big area of focus that needs to continue. I think with specifics to how do we then catalyze this just transition pathway and bring in voices, this again is where the public sector and the private sector just need to work much closer together. Part of this is about public policy. It's about local community development policies that need to be brought, and then effectively looking at how the private sector, and in my case particularly the finance sector, can help support that with financing, with the tools, and learn the lessons of the sort of growth that we've seen in, say, green bonds, and really start to think about how we can apply the same technology and techniques to really mobilize capital to be moving into these areas as well.
And which opportunities would you say are most promising at the moment?
I mean, I think as a whole, what is really encouraging is clearly the move and momentum that we are seeing in things like renewables. So, IRENA calculates that just renewables alone will probably create 42 million new jobs out to 2050. And so, notwithstanding sort of some of the supply shocks that we've seen over the last 12 months, I think there's a huge amount of momentum there as well. Where it gets trickier, and I think this is again where public sector and private sector need to come together, we kind of also need to develop an economy-wide view that says in a certain situation, in a certain market, by taking these tools, you'll effectively either reduce or take out the carbon budget from one area, and then that may get offset by another area, but net actually you are moving to a more net zero aligned pathway. And I think those kind of tools and techniques really still need to be developed. And then from the finance sector, we need to think about how we can then bring that into transaction by transaction, client by client review.
What's the value of multilateral banks, of DFIs, development finance institutions, in this kind of work? Are they relevant to you, or is it a different part of the sector?
No, I think they're absolutely critical. I mean, as I sort of mentioned, the amount of capital that needs to flow into the global south is a step change from what we've seen before. Now, I think I feel quite proud of the fact that of the $9.8 billion of sustainable finance assets that we had last year, 70% was generated and supported low-income countries. And the reason we were able to do that is because we work very closely with partners in the development finance community and in the multilateral community through things like blended finance. And so finding these ways of risk sharing to deliver impact on the ground in the markets where it really matters, but also ensure that you're doing it in a risk-adjusted way that allows what is effectively a profit-making institution like a bank to scale that project and repeat it is absolutely critical. So it is only through those kind of partnerships that I think that we're going to see that done in a way that kind of makes sense and really needs to be repeated and scaled as much as possible.
That's great, thank you. I'm conscious that we've got just about 1¼ minutes left. What would you give this audience your top takeaway?
I mean, I think, as we saw with the pandemic, no one will transition unless everyone transitions. And the reality is in sort of the global south, unless we see a significant change in the emissions pathways that allows living standards to continue to rise at the same time, that transition will not happen. And if that doesn't happen, then we estimate that global warming will hit sort of 3 degrees by 2100, right? So we absolutely, sitting here in London, need these markets to transition as much as they need to transition as well. How we work out just financing mechanisms that really support that so that we can collectively get the benefits out of movement towards net zero while minimizing those costs, I think is the key question that both the private sector and the public sector need to focus on over the next 12 to 18 months.
Fantastic. Daniel, that was really powerful. Can I invite the audience to give a round of applause? And now delighted to welcome Sumaya Keanes for the next presentation. Thank you.